Hello, CUBE community, and welcome back to this special podcast co-hosted by one of our fabulous analysts, George Gilbert, and myself, Savannah Peterson. Today, we are going to be continuing our conversation on the road to intelligent data apps with a focus on unbundling the supply chain, a very important topic and a big piece of the transformation every large company is facing right now. We're super excited today to be joined by Gurdip from Blue Yonder to talk us through the complexity and how companies can approach this with less of a headache. Gurdip, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you so much, Savannah. Really good to meet you and good to meet you as well, George. Glad to have the opportunity to continue the dialogue.
Good to see you again, Gurdip. Okay.
Yeah, we're really having I gotta say we're big fans of Blue Yonder over here at theCUBE. We had your CEO at our NYSE NRF event and lots of inspiring stuff, lots of data. You guys are absolutely crushing it, working with over 3,000 of the largest brands in your space. Just to give the audience some context, you certainly know how to do what you're talking about at scale within the industry. Gurdip, when we were chatting just a second ago before we went live, you said that you have a fantastic example for us to illustrate the complexity of what's going on with a food and beverage company. Could you talk us through that?
You bet, Savannah. So, I think all of us who hasn't gone to the grocery store recently or gone online and ordered something that you really like. And the thing is that one action triggers such a chain down the entire supply chain that is almost impossible to put it all together. But this is what happens. A brand owner, a food and beverage company, is super interested in you as a consumer getting the product you want at the time you want it from the location you want it. And in order for them to get it right, they're in constant communication with their channel partners, be it online or in a physical store. And that conversation gives them intelligence, not just from what they have done in the past, but actually through that conversation, what's actually happening in the store. That external information needs to now be married with information they have internally for them to come up with a forecast, which they try to do their best to get right. But that forecast, which could be days or weeks out, almost always is wrong and is corrected based on the actual order that the channel places, the retailer places, or the online marketplace places. And that creates a whole chain reaction because the best laid plans are now dead. And there is a need for that salesperson who's been working with that channel partner to go figure out, can they meet that higher demand for your favorite product and get it to the store in time? That's a question that they may not be able to answer by themselves. And so they now need to figure out, can the supply chain colleagues in their company support them? And guess what? The supply chain colleagues, as hard as they might want to get things, they might want to work and meet the demand, they have to live within the constraints of what a carrier, that is another company that needs to deliver the product, can do. And so all of a sudden, in the simple act of you ordering the product from an online web page, the company has gone through this entire motion of getting the retailer, the brand owner, carriers, and in some cases, suppliers to these brand owners to all collaborate so that when you place the order, that moment of truth for you as a consumer or a shopper can actually come to life.
I love that. So how many, actually just for fun, how many different processes do you think are going on in the background between me clicking on that thing that I want to purchase and that object being delivered to me?
And let me add to that question, not just how many are there, but how many have to now interoperate. Whereas before you had to bridge them with these, shallow pipes with, data batching one to the other. Now, how do they connect and interoperate real time?
This whole, both Savannah, your question and George's question are spot on. That's actually the complexity, because not only are these processes that have to interact and interoperate, but there are humans involved and there are machines involved. And there is a capability that has to be brought to bear that actually synchronizes dozens, if not hundreds of processes together so that you can get the experience that you need. And it goes across, the complexity is magnified, George and Savannah, because it's not just happening within one company, it's happening across companies. And so the way I like to think of it is, in some sense, for you to achieve the shopping experience that you want, all of these companies have to achieve what we describe as a concurrent and boundaryless process experience. And what that means is concurrent and boundaryless has to exist in 3 dimensions that are super critical for it all to work together. The first is it has to go across functions. That's obvious. It has to go across functions in each of these companies so that they can all communicate and collaborate on a common data platform that allows them to see one version of the truth. But this is not just happening across functions and processes. This is also happening in a dimension of time. Because in order for you to be able to get the order that you place today, these companies have to plan and execute on what needs to happen days and weeks in advance. And so there is a synergy that has to happen in a time horizon that goes from strategic to tactical to operational, which typically has happened in different silos of data and applications, because technology did not exist for all of them to be in the same system, to be in the same data cloud. And the computational power didn't exist to actually close the gap between decisions that were made at the strategic level and what's actually happening at a day, a week, or even an hour, even at an hour granularity. So you're looking at a concurrent way of operating and a boundaryless way of operating, not just across functions, but across time. And bringing them together is an extremely involved and complex activity that is at the heart of what makes your shopping experience as good as it can be.
Well, and there's, it's interesting to think about all of these moving pieces. I mean, in the digital transformation conversation, a single source of truth has always been the goal. You look at all the SaaS companies in that space, and I swear it's on every tagline. But what I think is really interesting in this is it's not only on the company side to really understand the optics of what's going on, but when we're talking about the longevity or the lifetime of something that can go stale on the grocery store shelf, or the down to the minute or the hour delivery window on Amazon Fresh, to your exact point, that Z axis, that time complexity of this has actually got to be one of the more challenging parts. So I'm curious, I mean, especially as we accelerate with the amount of data and everything that's going on with AI, this certainly isn't going to get less complex. And I can imagine being just a little bit wrong in the beginning of this process leads to a very poor experience on the back end for the end consumer. You mentioned when you started this great example that the forecast is often wrong or almost always wrong. First of all, why is it always wrong? And second of all, how does then the consumer not see that was wrong? How is that that behind the curtain unfold?
You bet. So there are several questions you asked. So let me just unpack it one by one.
Yeah, sorry, I'm really stacking them up for you, Gurdip. I know you can handle it.
So the first piece of it is, this is firstly about not just having data in one place or a data cloud. It's like what George and I think you and I had discussed in a prior conversation. It's about making sure that there is a correlation between the process and the use of the data, and making sure that those are synchronized just as much. So there is an element of tying the data and the process to the business outcome that's super critical. And that's part and parcel of what is absolutely essential for supply chains to succeed. The second piece of it is, there is a lot of data out there. And the reality is that as humans, there is only a finite number of variables that we like as humans to be able to deal with. And there's a lot of activity that needs to happen to not just bring the data in one place, but to then synthesize it, which is where, Savannah, and you will not be surprised, agents have come to the fore in a very large way. So what our thinking around this has been that if you want to get to the right data, because nobody's a magician, you can't just snap your fingers and solve a problem. Having the right data, both external and internal, is critical. Having the agents in place to secure the data, to pull it all together, to analyze it, and to infer from it what needs to be done is possible and required, because as a human, you're not going to be able to do it all. And then what is absolutely essential, which is the last part of what you asked, which is around, there is inherent uncertainty, because we're all very comfortable with one number forecasts. But the reality is, when you dig underneath the covers, because of the uncertainty, forecasts tend to be in ranges. Just like you think about the weather, you're right. You can get the weather right for the next half an hour, for the next hour or two, but even 3 hours or 4 hours or 8 hours later, it will be somewhat different. And that's because there are always factors at play that you can't fully model. And having that uncertainty and understanding that band of uncertainty allows businesses to create formality around risks and opportunities. Risks if they carry too little inventory and miss Savannah placing her order and getting the product on time, or if they carry too much inventory, then they now have a problem on their hands that they have to go resolve. And so part of what supply chains are getting better at, I can't say they're all there yet, is not just understanding the one number forecast, but understanding the inherent uncertainty in that forecast, as well as the inherent uncertainty in their own assumptions around supply and lead times and what the supplier will actually be able to do, so that you can then put the right amount of inventory in the shelf or in the warehouse to meet the order that a shopper might place. So there is this incredible ballet of very fine steps that have to happen to get to the outcome that you are seeking, and that orchestra must come together to make it happen.
So do you also do ballet when you're not leading?
Absolutely, it's my favorite thing to do.
Well, let me build on Savannah's question, which is, starting from what the consumer sees, which is they want to make sure when they go to the store, what they want to buy is in stock. But there's behind that, like a forecast that's got to be, that I assume comes from multiple dimensions. We got to forecast by region, by product, by however many different perspectives, and that gets rolled up. But then there are operational plans that are built off that one forward-looking assumption. And so my question is, and I'm the techie here, which is, are there a bunch of agents that are now augmenting human operators and replanning as we keep getting things that are outside, expectations? And do we have this change in the planning cycle where the agents are working on behalf of human supervisors, updating plans with a frequency that humans couldn't do, because they're looking at more scenarios and they're taking into account uncertainty, but it's chained in all these different dimensions. And so behind this one forecast, to make sure that there's, when Savannah goes to the store, what's in stock, satisfies her, that there's this machine that's all interoperating seamlessly at a pace that we couldn't imagine before.
I have a great example, and you're spot on, because really what we're talking about is, and a great analogy might be the fly-by-wire aircraft that have existed since the 80s and 90s, first in military aircraft, but now across the board. There is this requirement that agents are existing and operating continually around the clock, looking at variety of sources of risks that might affect your supply chain. They could be risks from external sources. They could be risks from your own sales and marketing teams that might be picking up on what the customer or the competitor is doing. And it's all being brought in. So as an example, let's say this is a real example where we have an agent that goes out there and evaluates the risk to your purchase orders that might be coming from both natural disasters, some of which we are all very familiar with as they're happening right this moment, but also a political uncertainty that might be out there. And it's all being brought to bear in a manner where that information which is coming independent of any knowledge of your supply chain, is then married to how your supply chain is structured, how inventory flows for your supply chain. And that agent then talks to another agent without the human being present to actually identify what specific purchase orders have been impacted because of that risk in the external world. Not only that, the next step of saying, because this purchase order was impacted, the following customer orders are going to be impacted, is then identified, and resolution options are presented to the planner so that when the planner logs in or actually receives that message on their handheld, they can now understand that a risk that they were completely unawares of, a disruption in LA or somewhere else, has impacted their ability to meet demand in Dallas. And now they have the option of either going to an alternate supplier or presenting their customer with an alternate product, because there's just no way for them to get the product from LA to Dallas. And that kind of a disruption is something that is being managed at what I call event-driven actioning through agents. And it's not just one agent, George. It literally is a number of agents that are working together, with humans not necessarily being fully aware of where the risks are coming from, but them having done all that hard work. A human planner can now go in and truly understand where the risk originated, what are the options, and how they should react to it.
Let me just drill into this from the techie angle, because that's my my comfort zone, which is help us understand why this functionality belongs in agents, or which functionality belongs in agents versus what could have or was only the province of procedural code before. In other words, what was in the deterministic procedural code layer before, what couldn't you do then, and what's appropriate then for the agents?
Yeah. So I think it's absolutely fair. There are two very specific aspects of the kind of information that we are talking about that are hard to start from a procedural standpoint. The first of which is that the information that we are talking about getting isn't coming from a structured source. It's coming from news media. It's coming from information sources that humans are generating, perhaps in conversations, in discussions that they are having with their business partners and trading partners, as well as some sources of information that are more structured, but even to the sense that they are not necessarily structured in that they are able to speak the language of the objects that might reside within your system. They're completely agnostic to how you may have thought about your system. So for example, your system might have got a 2-letter code for LA or LAX or whatever it might be, whereas someone else might be calling it Los Angeles or this Orange County or something else. And you have to now go through the process of taking that information and semantically equating it to an object that exists in your environment. So there's that bridging of the gap that has to occur between natural language and your system that lends its LLMs and agents ideal for that activity. The second thing that's happening out here is this isn't just about one source, and this isn't just about one source that's definitive. This is where you being able to look at multiple sources, corroborate the information, is almost a very human activity before you can say this actually occurred. Because me just getting a source of information from some website is not the same as me getting a source of information from the LA Times or from AP or from some registered government agency putting information out. And we need to make sure that not only is the information coming in, but the accuracy and the confidence of that information is also understood. And this is another area where allowing these agents to work across these different sources allows you to create a much higher or a much richer and a much more definite source of information to work with. So that's an angle that I think if you were to imagine, even before you get into having some kind of a procedural system that's able to react, creating that input is something that was not possible. That's where agents are really, really helpful. The next thing that's happening is, as systems such as ours on supply chain have moved away from this whole paradigm of batch-driven planning, you now have the inherent ability, because these are all cloud native services that are now on our platform. It's possible for us to take these events and immediately understand the impact of what that event might be. Now, the impact itself, you may call upon procedural logic to go out and get finite values, because you can't afford the hallucination that an agent might do in that regard. You need some definitive information about it. But it's again, once you know what that outcome or that impact is, going back and putting information in a manner that allows you to present the options to the human operator of the supply chain so that they can digest all of that information and make decisions meaningfully is another place where agents absolutely excel. And we found that extending the agents, going beyond data collection and analysis and synthesis into actioning, is a very doable activity, while we manage to marry the logic on the supply chain decisioning and the impact to supply chains from all of the rich IP that we built in how supply chain decisions are made over the last 2 or 3 decades. So that's been the marriage of LLMs with procedural code, the way I have at least tried to solve such problems.
Savannah, you go ahead.
Need like a little army of Scott. When I think of these agents, I think of them as little explorers going out or retrieving all these little messages and coming back to you, hanging out in the, like in the cafeteria and being like, look, this is what I found. Okay. And you still need a human neural processing unit or a compute neural processing unit to be able to decipher what that all means. And to your point, do intelligent decision-making. I'm curious because you see this applied and deployed in a lot of unique environments and very much at scale. What are some of the common misconceptions people have about this, or companies have, and some of the common mistakes that you see people making that you're steering them on the right path?
Yeah, I think I think if you look out there, agents and LLMs have been most successfully leveraged in what I would call as customer service type use cases that are out there. I think there's growing body of evidence that there's a very good incremental effectiveness that this technology can bring to internal productivity in general, both in development, but in business functions within organizations. I think where people are maybe misusing would be the right term to use, perhaps. Misusing agents is to expect, and this is both a matter of both accuracy and cost, misusing agents to do the kinds of things that the algorithms and heuristics that have existed for a while have actually done really, really well already. And so there is that marriage that I would say, it's the mixed use of agents together with IP that is at proven IP that's running at in a cost-effective manner, that does not have the hallucination, needs to be brought together. And we keep pushing the boundary on it, because you do, to the point, Savannah, earlier, not only do we want the agents to come and get the information, I think they do a darn good job of synthesizing it. But what you want to do is, once that information is synthesized, you want to use the IP that's available and proven and does not hallucinate, to actually come up with very precise predictions, at least in the supply chain world. And these are reasoning and logic models that go beyond where LLMs are today. I'm not saying that they won't get there ever, but where LLMs are today. So we're bridging that gap with other IP. And then again, on the outside, once that is completed, going back to the business users and explaining to them why certain decisions were made or why certain recommendations were made is another part where agents truly excel. So we bring that together in an effective way in that manner.
Is there a learning cycle? We touched on this in the last conversation, but I'm hoping you can flesh it out some more, where when something goes wrong, we talked about exception conditions, that the agents might try and diagnose. There's this, there's this representation of the business that I think we talked about was encoded in this knowledge graph.
Yeah.
And the knowledge graph it's a horrible term, but it's basically a representation of the people, places, things, and activities in procedural form or encoded symbolically. But there's uncertainty in it. And you were explaining last time that I had this assumption that, if something goes wrong, someone goes in and you run a query and you figure out this is connected to this, and that tells you why something goes wrong. And you're like, no, it's not that simple. Explain why it's not that simple, and then why learning over time allows the system to make recommendations as to what might be going wrong.
Correct. So I think in general, for the longest time, systems have operated on this basis of exception-driven activity or exception-driven planning and decisioning. And I think what we are urging the community to move to is away from the exception-driven paradigm to more of an insight-driven paradigm, because we need to recognize, that example of a natural disaster in one part of the country causing delays to customer demand in another part of the country. If you continue down that path, the reality is that while today that might be the reason for the delay, tomorrow it simply might be because the supplier that was responsible for bringing the product just, they had an accident. And because of the accident, everybody else was fine. It wasn't an LA problem. It was the supplier problem. Or the fact that the product is delayed has nothing to do with either a natural disaster or the supplier, the carrier moving the product from LA to Dallas. It may have everything to do with the supplier is delayed. And the reality is that when you think about an exception, the exception being something is delayed from the expected date, it's now coming a day later or a week later. The root cause for that could be a number of things. Which one of those things does it happen to be in this particular instance is very much both a discovery process, and there's a probabilistic aspect to it. And you want to be able to make sure that not only are you able to, in a fast way, which is where knowledge graphs are just wonderful, you're able to decipher what are all the entities that have a relationship with this order that could have impacted the order, and you search every one of those paths, while at the same time, you leverage the goodness of what we've been talking about, agents, to, instead of it being a completely procedural search, you allow these agents to go out, do their exploration, and come back and collate the information for you and say, well, you're delayed. The root cause could be A, B, or C. In this case, a natural disaster, a carrier being late, or a supplier being late. From all the data that we have, it's most likely nothing to do with a natural disaster or a carrier. It's the supplier. And by the way, I looked at the last 3 weeks of information, and the supplier is always late by 3 days. So no wonder. And by the way, I've ruled out that there was a natural disaster, and I've ruled out that the carrier is late because I got a ping from them. So it must be this. So my recommendation is go to an alternate supplier. And that kind of analysis is something where you're bringing the information together in a meaningful way while dealing with the uncertainty.
Okay. This is something, all right, this gets at a bunch of themes that are really valuable, which is, so it sounds like the agents synthesize a bunch of context that a human then applies judgment to. But also what I want to ask then is, what is the interplay of the agents synthesizing all this information and then human using their judgment and domain expertise adding to the symbolic representation of what's connected to what?
Right.
In other words, there's this interplay between using the agents and building out the symbolic representation of the business. I know it's horribly abstract, but maybe you can make it concrete for us.
So as a human, I might have a playbook in place that says every time there is a delayed purchase order, follow this path. The reality is that over time, as more and more information is gathered, depending on this situation, variants are created, and you as a human are making a judgment call on, because a certain metric is of importance, let's say cost of delivery or on-time delivery to the customer, you are deciding a particular resolution path. As you add information to the system in terms of you choosing a particular set of path under a given set of conditions, that information now becomes food in some sense for the knowledge graph itself, where previously you might have simply said, these are the three options. And now you can layer onto that knowledge graph that says, yeah, those are the three options, but option B is actually my first priority, option C is my second priority, and option A is really my third priority. And I want you to go incrementally add that relationship to what was previously maybe a non-tiered relationship that you might have captured. And so there is enrichment of the knowledge graph that occurs through the actioning, through this interaction between the agent making a recommendation and you as a human selecting it. That is a very rich paradigm. It very much it very, in learning systems, that's very much how learning systems operate. And this is a poorer or a poor man's version of a learning system that I'm talking about, early days, if you will. But that's how the knowledge graph itself gets enriched in, and then can be used in that manner for the agents to operate going forward.
Sweet. So, okay, so this is a fun one. I'm curious, when we think about implementing new technology, it doesn't always come cheap. When we're thinking about implementing agentic AI at scale, it's probably not going to come cheap yet, at least. But so I'm curious, that said, obviously this transformation is going to lead to more efficient, less wasteful supply chains across the board as a result of these insights. What do you think the consumer, or I guess you probably already know, what does the consumer see on the other side? Is it about preserving an experience that they've already come to expect? Is it about surprising and delighting even more? Will we see prices go up or down as a result of these implementations?
Yeah, I've seen an evolution, Savannah, and it's still evolving. A few years ago, mostly prior to the pandemic, to be honest, supply chains were very much a cost metric to an organization. It is how efficiently can I get the product to where it needs to be, how, in some sense, what's the lowest cost I can get it at, and that used to be the way a lot of companies thought about it. And then the pandemic hit, and it no longer became just a CFO cost function conversation. It became a board level conversation. It became an existential conversation. And continuing into today, as people are trying to figure out what the new regulatory environment will look like, what the new policies will look like, and of course, we're all expecting them to change almost all the time. I think there's enough of a recognition now that you cannot let supply chain be the reason why your business is not successful, or frankly, going out of business. And so I almost to a customer, every customer that I speak to is engaged in activity in figuring out how to leverage firstly, this event-driven, boundaryless, concurrent supply chain planning process and system that will interoperate. And secondarily, and just as importantly in some sense, in some of the customers at least, how do agents truly transform their ability to operate their supply chains? Because I think they recognize, and retailers have for a long time, because of Amazon and everybody else and the experience that Amazon was able to bring to the table, but now it's pervasive. Everybody recognizes the importance of getting this right. Nobody wants to be left behind the competition, because really, there are enough categories of products out there, and we all know this. If you don't find the product you're looking for, as important as brand loyalty is, and it is, you will go for an alternate product if that's what you need at that point in time. And it plays itself out in the evolution of companies like Shein and others on the apparel side, as much as it plays out on the consumer electronics or on the packaged goods side. So it's across the board. It's pervasive.
Gurdip, you said, something interesting, that with the pandemic, the supply chain became a board level concern. And I'm wondering, because you and I have talked before, that I used to call it like sales and operations planning. And you're like, no, there's a new terminology, integrated business planning, about how it's not just supply demand matching, it's shaping the activities, shaping demand, shaping supply, and all the operations in between. 30 years ago, we talked about ERP as an attempt to integrate all the operational activities of the organization. Are we now rethinking this notion that we can integrate now all the processes in the organization and beyond, the partners? And is it integrated business planning that is this new killer app that is the fulcrum, and who in the organization then owns that?
Yep. No, absolutely. So, let me start with this premise, right? The most important decisions that are made within a company by the CEO, the COO, the CFO are all around resource allocation. And, when we think about it in that sense, and you think about supply chain being absolutely essential to your business, what you really need to understand is that if the objective of the organization is to grow the business or to acquire market share, it requires them to essentially operate a synchronized set of business functions that mean that there's the right kind of sales coverage and presence, there's the right kind of marketing and promotional activity in place, that supply chain, both from a sourcing and a production and a distribution perspective, is able to do what's required. And oh, by the way, it's delivering to the EBITDA projections that you as a company are expecting. So you cannot do this without having this all in concert. You cannot just do this at a very high level and have a completely disconnected execution motion at an operational and tactical level. And so integrated business planning allows you to bring that connectivity within the organization, just like you mentioned. And it is always supply chain is a critical component to it, but it's owned by an independent broker, perhaps in the CFO organization or in the COO organization, that is able to allow for the sales, the marketing, the product, the brand, the supply chain, all of these organizations to not just come together, but to be held accountable so that things actually operate. But then this is where this integrated business planning gets really interesting. Just like we said at the very outset, in the first example we talked about, it's great to have this synchronization within the four walls of the enterprise, but what about the suppliers? But what about the carriers? Because those organizations, even though they don't appear within your org structure or within your balance sheet and P&L statements, they are absolutely critical for your success as a company. And so this integrated business planning process, married to a network that is capable of meeting your business needs strategically, operationally, tactically, is absolutely paramount. And so we have gone down this route, like you and I discussed, where we put in place the integrated business planning paradigm that is for this concurrent event-driven supply chain, that is leveraging AI agents the way we talked about, but is also on a network connected to carriers and suppliers and customers, so that you're able to orchestrate in harmony what would otherwise have been very siloed functions. S&OP was very much a demand-supply match. It's almost missing the big picture by not having new product introduction and timing, or new marketing activities and those impacts to sales, or frankly, dealer negotiations with your customer and channel on what incentives should be on invoice or off invoice, so you can have an excellence in commercial operations come through as well. Bringing it all together is really the function of integrated business planning, along with demand and supply, along with your suppliers, along with your carriers.
So just a question on like, this becomes the glue, the enterprise glue, that the sort of anchor application that ERP once was, like many decades ago. And I guess,
it's the operating system. It's literally the operating system for a business.
Okay.
And so it's in many ways that's why when you it's an excellent question. So who owns this? It must be someone in the COO or the CFO office that is capable of orchestrating it across the board. Now you can choose to start in supply chain, you can choose to start in commercial operations, you can choose to start wherever, but at the end of the day you need that one ubiquitous system in place that everyone is leveraging so that it all comes together.
But Savannah, let me just ask one more question on this. This is a very strategic function when you talk about an operating system, really for a company and its ecosystem. Like my question is, do you start building repeatability in other words, industry specific versions, or might someone emerge who builds it for an industry, let's say like an Instacart has done, kind of from scratch?
Yeah.
And then the other part is, like, Instacart now prices based on outcomes, like customer outcomes. They get marginal cost from their customers.
Yeah.
And at what point, at sort of how much value do you capture, since you're adding so much value to your customers' outcomes?
Yeah. So the way we've done it, George, is, and this is across the board. So the capabilities that we built on a platform that go across planning and execution. And by that I mean it's not just the decisioning aspects of it's how you actually execute it in your logistics network, in your warehouse. And so the way we have approached it is that we've taken an industry, or I would even say sub-industry point of view, where we go to market with you as a retailer, but truly an apparel or a soft line specific retailer, or a hard lines retailer, or a grocer, or a mass merchant. You need a certain type of system that's in some sense tailored to your needs, different from if you were a semiconductor manufacturer, different from if you were a food and beverage brand owner, and so on. I'll give you a great example. We've gone in a very dedicated way to the LSP sub-industry vertical, or the industry vertical, which is all of these, the 3PLs and 4PLs that are out there that we work with. Their whole business is about creating this platform whereby they can fulfill product for a retailer, for instance, or for a brand owner. And we have essentially created the environment by which they can work with us to take our solutions, so that when they go into one of their customers, or they go out and try and acquire business, they are essentially positioning the goodness of our platform as a core capability and differentiator for them. And then every customer, as they grow and they win, we win, and we participate in that growth with them. So that's a model that we are very comfortable with as well, because it allows us to essentially have our incentives aligned. And it's not about us selling in and them consuming. It's about us winning together.
Love that ethos. And just taking that a step further, Gurdip, I thought it was interesting. Your CEO, Duncan, when he was dropping some knowledge on his last CUBE episode, highlighted the fact that, just building on this food and bev storage, that we waste 1 billion meals a day, and that supply chains are responsible for 60% of the world's carbon emissions. So it's not just winning together as companies or as people, it's also winning together as the planet, right?
It absolutely is. And this has been, Duncan's been very clear from the outset. And at a time when not very many people were talking about it, supply chains have always been about abundance. I think what he's brought in a very focused manner is it's got to be sustainable abundance that we deliver to. And to that end, in our last launch of 24.4, there are very specific capabilities that go towards addressing just that problem. So both from how do you source products, how you manufacture them, but also just as importantly from how you deliver those products. We've actually gone out and partnered with and actually acquired data from systems, from providers that we then bring into our system, so that when companies make decisions to optimize sourcing and manufacturing or distribution through the logistics network, we're able to tell them, not just by looking at the rearview mirror, this is what happened, but we're actually able to help them make decisions that will optimize or reduce to the extent possible without sacrificing the customer need dates, the cost from a sustainability perspective in the form of carbon emissions, but also in the form of waste, Savannah, because that's the other way. It's one thing to actually waste fuel and move product when you didn't have to. It's another thing to actually go out and get the product and then waste it because it went, you couldn't use it, so you had to discard it. And both those elements have been built into the way we allow our customers to take advantage of our capabilities now.
I think it's really important that you just highlighted that, and honestly, congratulations to y'all on the team. But what you essentially just affirmed is that it is possible to be sustainable and not have to increase costs or do things better. It's really just about optimizing these business processes.
It is an imperative, and I don't see that as the black and white that it's sometimes portrayed in the media and other places. There is a very pragmatic way to move the needle on this, and to the point that Duncan was making, there's such a large opportunity out here. There's so much low-hanging fruit for us to go after that, working together, all of us, we need to do this. It's important for the planet.
All right, Savannah, maybe it's time for you to bring us home.
I think that's such a beautiful message to close on. I really love that you've taken us all the way from the grocery store shelf to greenhouse gases and taking care of Mother Earth while giving us a technical voyage there. Gurdip, it's very clear that you and the Blue Yonder team are doing some really awesome stuff, and I can only imagine how busy you are. So thank you so much for taking the time today to chat through this with us. This has been just a fantastic one.
It's a pleasure, Savannah. Thank you for taking the time and for having me on theCUBE again.
Thanks, Gurdip.
And thank you, George. Always a joy to go on this wonderful technological ride with you. And thank you to all of our fantastic listeners, wherever you may be on this beautiful rock. You're watching theCUBE, the leading source for enterprise tech news.